Buried inside the trade deal Trump just announced with so much fanfare sits a single technical fight that could be worth billions of dollars, and Canada just refused to lose it quietly. Washington wanted to cut its auto tariff from 25% down to 15%. Sounds generous on paper, but only exempt the American-made portion of every vehicle from that tax. Canada looked at that offer and pushed back hard, demanding the exemption cover all USMCA content, meaning Mexican and Canadian parts count too, not just American ones. That's not a minor accounting detail buried in legal fine print. That's Canada refusing to let Washington quietly rewrite what North American made actually means, in real time, in the middle of its own trade negotiation. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll break down exactly what's being fought over here, because the difference between these two proposals is worth billions of dollars to Canadian auto manufacturing. Then we'll get into why the U.S. originally structured its tariff this specific way, and why Canada's counterproposal directly undermines that entire strategy. After that, we'll cover the numbers already proving Canada has real leverage in this specific fight, straight from the White House's own trade data. We'll look at how unstable this whole deal actually is, because nothing here is locked in the way headlines are making it sound. And finally, we'll talk about why this one technical dispute might matter more to Canada's long-term auto industry than any other single-line item in this entire agreement. Let's start with the actual numbers on the table. According to Globe and Mail reporting, the U.S. has offered to cut its tariff on Canadian-built vehicles from 25% to 15%, while preserving an exemption specifically for the value of American-made content in cars assembled in Canada. Canada, in response, has pushed for the exemption to cover the value of all content sourced from anywhere within the USMCA zone, which means Mexican and Canadian components would count right alongside American ones. One detailed industry report laid out exactly why this distinction matters so much, calling it the core sticking point of the entire auto negotiation, because the two structures produce wildly different effective tariff rates depending on how a vehicle is actually built. It's worth understanding just how deeply integrated North American auto manufacturing actually is before diving further into this dispute, because that context explains why the fight is so consequential. A single vehicle assembled in Ontario might cross the US-Canada-Mexico border multiple times before it's ever finished. An engine block cast in Mexico, wiring harnesses manufactured in the American Midwest, transmission components built in southern Ontario, and final assembly happening back in Canada. This isn't a fringe manufacturing quirk. It's been the standard operating model for the North American auto industry for decades, built specifically around the tariff-free movement, guaranteed under NAFTA, and later, USMCA. Any tariff structure that suddenly starts distinguishing between American, Canadian, and Mexican content inside that same integrated supply chain isn't just adjusting a tax rate, it's asking an entire industry to fundamentally rethink how vehicles get built, essentially penalizing the exact cross-border efficiency the trade agreement was originally designed to protect. Think through the real math here for a second, because it's not abstract. A car assembled in Ontario with 50% U.S. content under the American proposal would only get that 50% shielded from the tariff, with the tax still applying to everything else, including the Canadian and Mexican parts that make up the rest of the vehicle. Under Canada's USMCA-wide proposal, if that same car had 50% U.S. content, plus another substantial share of Canadian and Mexican content, the exempted portion balloons dramatically, potentially pushing the effective tariff rate down into the single digits instead. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between an auto tariff that still meaningfully taxes Canadian manufacturing and one that's functionally neutralized for vehicles built with genuine North American supply chains. Now here's why Washington structured its original offer this specific way, and why Canada's counterproposal cuts directly against that strategy. Reporting on the auto tariff history makes clear the entire point of exempting only American content was to push more production south of the border, essentially using the tariff as a tool to incentivize automakers to relocate manufacturing into the United States rather than keep it spread across Canada and Mexico. Canada's proposal does the opposite. It explicitly protects the integrated cross-border supply chain that's defined North American auto manufacturing for decades, refusing to let the tariff quietly punish Canadian and Mexican-made parts just because they weren't stamped as American. It's also worth noting that Canadian officials have floated more than one version of a counter-proposal here, which suggests real strategic flexibility rather than a single rigid demand. Separate reporting indicates Canada has also considered a version that would apply tariffs only to content originating from outside North America entirely, effectively treating the whole continent as a single tariff zone regardless of which specific country within it produced any given part. That alternative framing achieves a similar practical outcome to the all-USMCA content proposal, but reframes the argument in a way that might be easier for American negotiators to accept politically, since it doesn't require explicitly naming Canadian and Mexican content as equally protected. It simply defines the boundary of what counts as domestic differently. Having multiple viable versions of essentially the same underlying demand gives Canadian negotiators room to trade concessions on the specific wording while still protecting the substance of what they're actually trying to achieve. And Canada isn't negotiating from a position of pure hope here either. There's real, documented leverage already on the table. According to the White House's own figures, Canada's counter-tariffs on American-made cars cut U.S. auto exports to Canada by $5.6 billion between April 2025 and March 2026, a 22% drop. That's Washington's own data confirming Canadian retaliation already inflicted serious, measurable damage on American auto exports, which means Canada walks into this specific negotiation with actual proof its countermeasures work, not just a theoretical threat. There's also a bigger structural fight happening in the background that makes this auto content dispute even more consequential. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has said he wants interim bilateral deals with both Canada and Mexico before moving toward a larger trilateral overhaul of the entire USMCA framework, one that would include new auto content requirements altogether. In talks with Mexico specifically, Greer has already demanded a 50% U.S. content requirement for vehicles. That context matters enormously, because whatever content formula Canada locks in during this current negotiation isn't just about today's tariff rate. It's likely to become the baseline Washington tries to build its broader USMCA renegotiation around. Canada, holding firm on an all-USMCA content standard right now, isn't just about this specific deal. It's about setting precedent before the much bigger trilateral fight even begins. This precedent-setting dimension deserves even more attention than it usually gets in day-to-day trade coverage. USMCA itself is currently sitting in a mandatory annual review process, triggered specifically because the United States declined to commit to a full long-term renewal back on July 1st of this year. That means the entire three-country trade relationship is scheduled for repeated, recurring negotiation rather than the multi-year stability the original agreement was supposed to provide. Whatever content formula gets established in this bilateral Canada-U.S. deal right now becomes a reference point every single time that annual review comes back around, either as evidence that an American content-only standard is achievable and should be expanded, or as evidence that an integrated North American standard already has precedent and should simply be formalized going forward. Canada isn't just negotiating today's tariff rate, it's negotiating the starting position for a fight that's now built to recur every single year. To be fair, none of this is finalized, and it's genuinely important not to overstate how locked in this deal actually is. Every element of the arrangement, including the auto tariff cut, exists without the structural certainty a proper multi-year trade agreement would normally provide, because the Trump administration has already declined to renew USMCA for the long term, opting instead for a mandatory annual review process instead. That means even if Canada wins this specific content dispute, automakers are being asked to plan around a rate that could plausibly change again, well before any of these terms get formally locked into something more permanent. And notably, public opinion inside Canada itself has swung towards skepticism rather than relief about this entire deal, suggesting plenty of Canadians aren't ready to celebrate terms that remain this fluid and reversible. There's also the reality that the underlying 50% Section 338 tariff this whole negotiation is trying to avoid hasn't actually been withdrawn, it's paused. As of this week, the tariff schedule remains legally in force and could snap back into effect on short notice if talks collapse before the extended deadline, now pushed to the end of day this Friday. So even Canada's hard line on the auto content formula is being negotiated under the shadow of a tariff that could still land in full if this specific dispute or any other piece of the broader deal doesn't get resolved in time. There's a practical reason automakers themselves are watching this specific fight so closely too, beyond the abstract policy implications. Every major manufacturer building vehicles in Ontario, from Honda to Toyota to the Detroit 3, has spent years calibrating exactly how much American, Canadian, and Mexican content goes into each model, often down to individual components, specifically to optimize for whatever trade rules happen to be in effect at the time. A shift toward American-only content exemptions would force a genuine re-engineering of sourcing decisions across the entire industry, potentially pushing some production toward the U.S. at real cost and disruption to existing Canadian plants and their workers. An all-USMCA content standard, by contrast, lets manufacturers continue operating largely as they already do, without triggering a fresh, expensive reshuffling of supply chains that took decades to build in the first place. That's precisely why this fight carries weight far beyond its appearance as a narrow technical dispute over how tariff exemptions get calculated. So that's the full picture, a single line item buried inside a much larger trade deal, worth potentially billions of dollars to Canadian auto manufacturing, and Canada is refusing to simply accept Washington's version of it. Instead of settling for an exemption that only protects American-made content, Canadian negotiators are fighting to preserve the entire integrated North American supply chain that's kept this industry connected across 3 countries for decades. There's a reason this particular fight is worth watching more closely than the headline tariff percentages everyone's focused on. A tariff rate is a single number, easy to report, easy to compare against last year's figure. A content formula is the mechanism that actually determines what that number means in practice for any given vehicle, and mechanisms tend to outlast the specific rates attached to them. If Canada successfully locks in an all-USMCA content standard now, that framework doesn't just apply to today's 15% tariff. It becomes the template automakers, parts suppliers, and trade negotiators build around for years, regardless of whether the headline rate moves up or down in future rounds. That's exactly why Washington structured its original offer to isolate American content specifically, and exactly why Canada is treating this as a fight worth having rather than a technicality worth conceding just to get a deal announced faster. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments. Do you think Canada actually wins this specific fight over auto content, or does Washington hold the line on American-only exemptions?